I'm sure some of you guys have noticed that Steven Crowder has fallen out of relevance over the past few months, maybe years, honestly. I don't remember when that clip came out where he was like berating his wife. It was really actually fucking hard to watch, not even like funny to make jokes about. It was very obvious that he was like verbally abusing this lady and she was like distraught and stuff. It was a disgusting video. But ever since that, it felt like he has kind of waned in significance. Thankfully, thank the Lord. And due to that, it seems as though he is going balls to the wall and trying to make very extreme and just unpalatable claims to kind of claw back a bit of relevance. So if you guys have not seen it, if you're out of the loop, a couple weeks ago, Steven Crowder made a video where he is quite literally just defending fascism. Straight up defending fascism. So let's get into it. My boy, Steven Crowder, my Canadian brother, unfortunately, fuck. Why is it that when Canadians like get involved in politics, they're either like pretty based or they're horrible. Like you get like Steven Crowder, you get Jordan Peterson. I mean, there is one based Canadian, and I think you guys know who I'm referring to. It's me. All right, let's get into it. Can't wait for the Rabbi Shmuley segment. Yep. If you guys are watching this when this segment is repurposed over on YouTube, just know that if you become members, you get access to the live stream VODs in perpetuity, and then you can watch what we're about to do with Rabbi Shmuley. That sounds like we're about to do something like sinister with Rabbi Shmuley, because doesn't he own like a dildo factory or something? That's not what we're going to do with Rabbi Shmuley, just so you guys know. All right, let's get into it.
How often do you hear the accusation of fascism? Okay. What do you think it means? All right. To begin with, communism, Marxism, socialism, responsible for at least 100 million deaths in the 20th century.
All right, 38 seconds in and it's already the communism killed at least 100 million people. Okay, let's be very clear right now, because when people have died under the leadership of a communist party, it's been primarily due to, famines, wars, or other external circumstances that also take place in capitalist projects, yet those deaths never get tallied on to capitalism's death toll. There are plenty of suspicious sources that tend to inflate what they consider to be communism's death toll, with the infamous Black Book of Communism being the place where the, 100 million deaths figure was popularized. Problem with that book is it's political polemics. It's not a genuine inquisition into the topic. The book's own co-authors have denounced the scholarship involved in the book's creation, and its main author, I think his name is Stéphane Courteau. I don't know how to say French names. Stéphane Courteau? That's what I'm going to call him for the remainder of this segment, okay? They denounced Stéphane Courteau for being obsessed with reaching the 100 million deaths mark and doing whatever he could to artificially inflate the body count throughout the creation process of that book, the Black Book of Communism. The other co-authors, Nicholas Wirth and Jean-Louis Margolin, they actually tried to legally retract their contributions to the book once it was published, and Wirth condemned Courteau for trying to equate the communists with the Nazis, and they said that death camps didn't exist in the USSR. So this is kind of the purpose of this talking point. It's to vaguely say, well, 100 million people dead under communism. And the subtle ploy that is being levied here is to distract away from the death toll of fascists. And he's literally doing this, explicitly doing this here. This double Holocaust myth, that's a neo-Nazi talking point. It's meant to diminish from the fact that what the Nazis did and what the fascists did and what the colonialists did, like the British and the French, this was race-based murder, genocide, on the basis that the genocidaires felt that they were racially superior to the people they were killing. This is fundamentally different, and I hope to be able to demonstrate this as the video goes on. Courteau's methodology throughout the Black Book of Communism has been repeatedly denounced since the book has been published. One of the largest flaws about it is that he relied on this catch-all category called excess deaths, where he just lumped in premature deaths that came either directly or indirectly from government policies, famines, epidemics, economic disasters, so on. His goal here, like I said, in flattening all of these different phenomena into one excess deaths category is so that he could subconsciously equate these deaths with the deaths that took place at the hands of the Nazis. But like we already said, this is fallacious. The Nazis systematically murdered people because their identitarian politics convinced them that they were racially pure, superior to these people who they deemed inferior. This is fundamentally different than people dying in like a war or a famine that's taking place in a communist project. Like, you can't really say that these are equally the same thing. If we applied this logic consistently, then the famines that destroyed the Indian subcontinent as it was under British colonial rule would be tallied onto capitalism's death toll. And those famines actually had to do with capitalism. Economist Amartya Sen, he has a 1981 paper on these famines where he blames entitlement failures for the catastrophes. He points the finger at things like speculative hoarding of rice by merchants, uneven distribution of labor demand, which left the vast majority of rural laborers out of the wartime activity boom, things like this. Sen also refutes the argument that there just wasn't enough food during these famines by showing that there was actually relatively more food around during the famine compared to just a few years prior when there was no famine and less food. So it was a distribution blunder. It was not a supply one. And other economists like Benjamin Selwyn, he has an article where he builds on Sen's work and pretty much says that, yeah, like the famines in the Indian subcontinent had to do with capitalist price mechanisms deciding who gets to live or die. That's like a verbatim quote. There's also the shock therapy, the privatization and like the market fundamentalism that was imposed across the ex-Soviet republics, which have been estimated to have contributed to around 3 million excess deaths. That's another direct example of explicit capitalist policies causing millions of deaths. There's also the anti-communist massacres all over the world that claimed millions of lives. This is something that William Blum called the American Holocaust, but Crowder would never. He would never point his finger at the appropriate culprits here, which are capitalism and anti-communism. On the other hand, the famines that did take place under socialism didn't really have much to do with the actual theory of socialism. They were undoubtedly exacerbated by bad government policies in certain instances, yes, but those policies had little to do with the writings of Marx or Engels. Mistakes like, say, Mao's Four Pests campaign, where sparrows were killed because they were eating crops, which then created an ecological imbalance that caused an increase in locust populations, which then devastated crops even worse. That has nothing to do with socialism or communism. I'm pretty sure Marx never wrote about fucking killing sparrows. These mistakes that Mao made ultimately exacerbated the famines in China, where food shortages and famines were already prevalent, right? Famines were occurring in China nearly every few years prior to Mao's rule. Yet those famines never got politicized the way Mao's famine did. Famines were frequent in China. All of the years leading up to Mao's rule, famine, 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 millions and millions. Here, let me find a list of all of the famines that took place prior to Mao. Look how far back it goes. 1333, 6 million. 1876 to 1879, 9.5 to 13 million people dead. Northern Chinese famine of 1901, 200,000 dead. Chinese famine of 1906 to 1907, 20 to 25 million dead. Chinese famine of 1920 to 1921, 500,000 dead. From 28 to 30, 6 to 10 million dead. You know, so the Great Chinese Famine, colloquially Mao's famine, gets horrifically politicized, while this one, not so much. And again, you can't in good faith compare people dying in an accidental famine to being hunted down by Nazis for being the wrong ethnicity. These are fundamentally different things, right? Also, it's worth mentioning that Mao's famine happened to be the last major famine in China, as you saw with that list, because the Communist Party was able to build up the country to the point where it could efficiently combat those catastrophes in the future. It built the infrastructure to be able to combat that. That's why in that list, you didn't see any other famines after Mao's. It's another point that's never really brought up by people like this.
For every semester of history, certainly economics, when you're looking at different socioeconomic systems, 100 million dead minimum to begin with.
Do you see how like this guy says shit and just doesn't back it up with anything? Holy fuck, where do you get the confidence?
Makes it pretty hard to say, religion is the cause of all wars, right?
What does he even say? What did he even say? They sound like fucking Scooby-Doo.
Makes it pretty hard to say, religion is the cause of all wars, right?
What the fuck did he even say there? Bro, get my brother a fucking Scooby snack. What the hell was that?
Makes it pretty hard to say, religion is the cause of all wars, right? 100 million dead, communism, that's the toll. Now, when action is taken,
religion is the cause of all wars, is what he said. All right.
A nation, and sometimes I will admit, very radical action taken to deal with the root ideology and systems that have led to the death of 100 million people, the left yells fascism. The problem is, fascism has been used historically, not in the way that you've been told. It's been used against communism because with communism, socialism, right, you vote them in, you have to shoot your way out. They don't leave once they attain power, and they nationalize.
Nationalizations are Marxist, guys. I don't know if you guys knew that. Mussolini nationalized the banks and major companies in the 30s. Was he doing a Marxism? Norway has a ton of nationalized companies and resources. Are we going with the argument that social democracy is just like the same thing as Marxism now? Maybe I'm being pedantic. Like, socialists do typically call for nationalizations, yes, but that's not exclusively a socialist thing. Socialists are more concerned with the working class's relation to production. So if the state nationalizes industry and the workers in those industries remain alienated from their labor and their workplaces remain undemocratized and the fruits of those nationalizations don't serve the masses, then a lot of socialists would take issue with that too. It's a little bit deeper than just nationalizations equals Marxism, but I'm giving this guy way too much effort right now.
And they nationalize the means of production distribution, which, by the way, is the goal of Marxism. So you've probably been taught, or maybe not even taught. You just have teachers point to historical examples of fascists. Maybe even just one or two and then go, see, fascism bad. Have you done a little bit more? Well, hold on a second. We always want to ask why. It doesn't justify it, but the left, who is so willing to ask why when someone commits a heinous crime against an innocent person and is willing to fight to get them out of prison, which they also don't believe in, that's a part of Marxism, they're not willing to ask,
what is this guy even saying?
Why?
Right now?
Someone may have risen to power with a mandate of the masses against the representatives of an ideology that has killed, again, 100 million people.
I'm so sorry. Does this logic apply to communists at all? Because I mean, want to look at the Cuban Revolution. There was the mandate from the masses for that. Mao's revolution, there was the mandate from the masses with that as well. I mean, you can't really have these huge revolutions without mobilizing the peasantry and the working class. This is just how all of those communist revolutions happened, and in every case they replaced a regime or a society that was incredibly worse, incredibly more structurally violent, had way more poverty. I mean, you want to look at China before Mao's revolution, where people were addicted to opium because of the British, or if you want to look at Tsarist Russia, where people lived in destitution.
So here's how we're going to define fascism. The way the left does. Every time someone does something to prevent the left from completely subverting a nation or to try and reverse course. The left wants you to believe that fascism, not Marxism, not communism, 100 million dead, is the biggest.
This is what happens when you build your entire argument on a false premise, when you don't substantiate the premise, and then you just have a presuppositionally flawed argument for the rest of your video. This is where it starts. Okay, I know he starts this off by going into Chile, and that's an area that I'm quite familiar with. I studied it quite a lot. I have family who fled Pinochet, so let's get into it.
Case 1, Chile. The story you were likely told, if at all, 73, far-right military dictator, Pinochet. You've heard this term a lot. It's become just a kind of a shorthand insult for a fascist. Pinochet ousted a democratically elected Allende after a coup. Here, we see this from The Atlantic. The ultimate lesson of the 1973 coup that brought in General Pinochet's dictatorship was that the people would not, in the end, be denied their choice. Foreign Affairs in there, it says, Chile once boasted a longer history of stable democratic rule than most of its neighbors in much of Western Europe. Now it is the last major country on South American continent to return to civilian government after a wave of authoritarianism. All right. So Pinochet came in. Oh my God. Okay. Here's the reality. From 1970 to 73, do you know what created Pinochet? It was the Marxist Salvador Allende. Far left Unidad Popular coalition. I'll just say it, Unidad Popular coalition. Socialists, communists, radicals. So what were the results, by the way? Why do you think Pinochet is still popular today? You can't poll it officially, but Pinochet was immensely popular. Also left, by the way.
Pinochet was immensely popular, and he left of his own will. This is the claim being made. There is so much fucking bullshit going on here. First and foremost, to frame Allende as like this hyper radical, like communist guy. Look, I love Allende. He was fundamentally different than the other communists who were more radical of his day. I don't even think you could call him a communist, really. He was a democratic socialist. And I do make the distinction with him and say like a social democrat, because Allende did actually envision a pathway to transition to a socialist economy. That is something that he was ideologically on board with. He thought highly of Marx. He wasn't just your typical like Nordic model social democrat. That's not accurate about Allende. But what he's saying right here, Pinochet being supposedly immensely popular and leaving of his own will, it's not true. There was a massive protest in 2019 due to the legacy of Pinochet's economic reforms and the fact that they are enshrined in the Chilean constitution to this day. The 1980 Pinochet-era constitution pretty much made it so that it was next to impossible for any Chilean government post-Pinochet to get rid of his legacy, because it introduced a mixed Senate and a binomial model that pretty much gave the Chilean right wing and Pinochet's ideological descendants veto power over Chilean politics, regardless of their minority status. Anyway, those 2019 protests, student-led protests, got to the point where the government felt pressured to hold a referendum in 2020 to see if the public wanted to scrap the Pinochet-era constitution, and 78% of the voters chose to authorize the process to completely rewrite Pinochet's constitution. Both attempts to change it have unfortunately failed, and the constitution hasn't yet been rewritten as of today, but this proves that Pinochet and his ideological project aren't nearly as popular in Chile as Crowder would like for you to believe. If that was the case, nearly 80% of voters wouldn't choose to scrap it, right? That doesn't make a lot of sense. This is also why Pinochet stepped down of his own volition, as Crowder puts it, because he had already locked in his power with that said 1980 Constitution, which was drafted and passed by his military. Okay, so he didn't need to physically be there anymore. His economic and political project was there to stay, and the Constitution made it nearly impossible to overturn. Nearly impossible. When the Constitution was implemented in 1980, it stipulated that a plebiscite would be held in 8 years to determine whether or not to extend Pinochet's presidency. So when that 1988 plebiscite came around and the vote took place, Pinochet was voted out. He was voted out. The only reason he stepped down from president peacefully was because he had already trapped the country in his neoliberal model anyway, and he remained the commander-in-chief of the army until 1998, and he assumed a senator for life seat. So it's not like he just stepped down and was like, all right, guys, enjoy politics. I'm going to go and, let the democratic process resume. He fundamentally altered it. It's just ridiculous to say what he's saying here.
Left of his own volition, which fascists don't tend to do. So why? Why would someone who was a military dictator, why would he come to power? Well, could it be because the socialist Marxists before him had inflation up 1,600%? Wages were down 35%?
Wow.
The socialist Allende responded with these price controls that, by the way, created an entire black market and enabled crime cartels. Basic goods were selling for like 142% over normal prices on the black market. So what happened was Pinochet, with overwhelming support, could have been anybody, let's be clear, went in and cleaned things up.
All right, so the claim here is that Allende's economy was so bad, then that's why Pinochet came to power. Okay. Allende's economy was sabotaged. It was sabotaged. The US government, CIA, foreign companies, private Chilean capitalists all teamed up to destroy Allende's economy. Nixon gave the order to Richard Helms, who was the CIA director, to make Allende's economy scream. The US gave El Mercurio, an anti-Allende propaganda outlet, over $1 million to undermine his rule. Foreign copper companies who had previously exploited Chile's rich copper reserves were literally suing or threatening to sue actors in Europe for buying copper from Allende, right? Copper was crucial to Chile's economy, so this devastated Allende's rule. The US implemented an invisible financial blockade on Chile. The international financial institutions and banks stopped issuing credit to Chile. The US companies that created the spare parts for Chilean machinery, which is a dynamic that was entrenched before Allende's rule, refused to sell spare parts to Allende, which led to an economic disaster when it came to production and distribution. Foreign companies like ITT, alongside the CIA, were funding capitalist strikes in Chile, where the bosses of trucking companies would refuse to distribute goods and create artificial scarcity to undermine Allende's economy and manufacture the consent for his overthrow. To combat that sabotage, Allende's economic advisors, who were structuralists, believed that printing money would be a viable short-term solution, and they believed that it would help boost production, which would then boost industrial output and naturally correct the inflation. But the external sabotage was just way too fucking strong for any of them to combat. That's what happened. Funnily enough, prior to this economic sabotage of Allende, Allende's economy was doing pretty well. It was doing pretty well in the first year. In fact, the CIA admitted this. This is a CIA document on Allende's economy. At the end of 1971, Allende claimed success in his management of the economy by pointing to an 8.5% jump in real gross domestic product, a lower inflation rate than under the previous administration, and the lowest unemployment rate in a decade. Reactivation of the economy resulted largely from Allende's early bid for popular support by sharply boosting the real wages of Chile's lower classes. Because of the consumer buying spree that followed, manufacturing output increased by 12% in 1971. Increased government outlays for housing also brought a 12% jump in construction activity. Both industries had ample unused capacity on which to draw, and their increased production activity brought about a decline in the unemployment rate in the Santiago area from 8.3% to 3.8%. This is the CIA fucking glazing the dude. So it's kind of unfair to blame Allende for the economic crisis and not mention the external interference.
Sure, you had a few communists who went for helicopter rides and we never saw them again. But if you weren't a communist, you weren't at great risk.
This is also just not true. Like, he targeted the lower classes, he targeted workers. Like, you didn't have to be a proven communist, an ideological communist.
Not whitewashing everything he did, as the left does with communists. But it was a response. So what did you see from 77 to 81? Average GDP growth was about 8%. Inflation fell to single digits from quadruple digits. Poverty went from 50% as a rate to 10%. Unemployment went from 15% down to 6%.
Hey, it's me from the editing booth right now, and I just realized that this fucking moron's own source is proving him wrong. Like, it says right there on the screen the opposite of what he's trying to put forth. However, the economic model in Chile under the Pinochet regime is a false triumph, as the policies benefited only a small percentage of the population and exacerbated income inequality. How do you miss that? Remember what he's saying here. He's saying, oh, he fixed the unemployment, he fixed all of this shit. Remember what he's saying, and we'll get into it in a second.
And this cannot be stated enough. Overwhelming support.
Pinochet saved the economy with free market capitalism. This is the claim. Crowder did not invent it. This is a very famous, libertarian, neoliberal, free market fundamentalist claim. They love to say this. Is it true? That's the question. So no, the myth that Pinochet's, free market fundamentalism was able to save the Chilean economy from Marxism and make it prosper is a narrative that was largely popularized by Milton Friedman and actually has little basis in reality. Contrary to popular belief, in 1975, just 2 years after the coup, the Chilean economy shrank by 13 to 15%. Shrank. Unemployment, which hovered at 3% under Allende, skyrocketed to 20%. And most importantly, inequality went through the roof. Chile is one of the most unequal countries in the world, and the deregulation of speculative financial markets led to an economic collapse in 1982. Chile's GDP plummeted by over 14%, external debt exploded to 14 billion, and unemployment hit unprecedented levels at around 30%. Keep in mind, Allende, when he was the president, as he was being sabotaged, unemployment still hovered around 3%. So if he was able to do that with all of that sabotage, is it really that much of an accomplishment to see Pinochet come in here and skyrocket the fucking unemployment? And more importantly, the way Pinochet weathered this storm in the 80s was by collecting the royalties that came from Codelco, which was a company nationalized by Allende that Pinochet never got around to privatizing. So Allende was quite literally saving Pinochet's economy from beyond the grave. Pinochet even engaged in his own nationalizations here to combat the failure of his free market ideology. I wonder if Crowder would ever consider him a Marxist for the fact that he did a bunch of nationalizations to save his ass. Because remember in the beginning, he was like, oh, nationalizations, that's Marxist. Pinochet did them, despite the fact that he branded his project as free market fundamentalism. When the going got tough, he started nationalizing because he realized you kind of need some state involvement here. There's also been synthetic control studies done that compare Chile's actual GDP per capita to a counterfactual weighted average of similar Latin American and I think Iberian countries that did not experience a dictatorship. And these studies have found that Chile's economy significantly underperformed for the first 15 years after Pinochet's coup. This is important because the whole narrative regarding Pinochet is that his autocratic rule, however brutal, was necessary to implement market fundamentalism by force. But the data disproves that. I'll have a main channel video detailing Pinochet's economic performance and disproving the Chilean free market miracle myth, so keep an eye out on that. It'll be after my Ramadan War video.
From the people for his reforms. It became known as the Great Chilean Experiment. By the way, even after he left power, they kept Pinochet's constitution. Did you know that?
I told you why, right? Because he rigged it. He rigged it through the Senate in the binomial model, so that a tiny right-wing Chilean minority can just veto anything. That's why, fucking idiot.
Well, I will say, as a byproduct, the natives of Chile did develop a persistent fear of helicopters that we're still working on.
Oh my God. What's this Steven Crowder video without fucking a little bit of racism, right?
Apocalypto now.
I understand. By the way, for Pinochet, I just want you to know, those numbers that you gave were long-term numbers. Mm-hmm. It wasn't just he did great for a short period of time and then it reverted back. This
guy fucking doesn't know anything. What about the 75 crisis? What about the 82 crisis? These were long-term numbers, he's saying? When the 1982 crisis hit, real wages didn't recover to their 1982 levels until 1988.
Reforms seem to have held and had long-term great benefit for the country.
Yep. And by the way, they don't always hold.
No.
But it is important to note that typically when you think fascist, you don't think someone who comes in with a mandate of the masses and improves the lives for everyone.
Or leaves office.
Right.
That's a weird one.
Right.
Usually.
Pinochet has a mandate of the masses and he left office and he passed his constitution that's still in use. All right, brother. He never had the mandate for the masses. The only time they put his popularity up for a free and fair vote, it showed that the majority didn't fuck with him. The Constitution is still in use because it was rigged from the start, as we explained earlier. Nearly 80% of Chilean voters authorized the process to rewrite the Constitution in 2020. Obviously, it's not that well-cherished of a document. And the only reason Pinochet left the presidency is because he locked in his legacy through said rigged Constitution, while remaining in charge of the army and assuming a senator for life seat.
Get rid of elections.
Right. Yeah. And I get it. Some people went on helicopter rides who shouldn't have. Okay. You think nobody else was being targeted under the socialist Marxist government? Have you looked anywhere in South America and seen there's always a coup?
Is this guy trying to say that Allende was like violently cracking down on his opposition? It's kind of the criticisms that like Marxist-Leninists and people who are a little bit more radical than Allende actually had against him. Funnily enough, Castro told Allende, brother, you got to get a grip on this shit. You got to crack down on some things around here because these people are going to overthrow your project. They're going to destroy your project. And he was right. I think Allende should have listened to Castro a little bit more, and he should have clamped down on those, you'd call them liberal openings or democratic freedoms a little bit to salvage his project, because what came instead was a fascist like Pinochet overthrowing him and then actually killing thousands of people and targeting tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people. So if my options are Allende kind of clamps down a little bit more and there's like, well, the press is a little bit suppressed, all right, brother, do that instead of having a Pinochet mass murderer on our hands. Sorry.
There's always a coup going on. Right now, so I guarantee you there's a coup. If it's not going on out in the public, it's being planned. Someone's planning a coup. There's a coup meeting. Let's look at another case study. Brazil.
I love how he just kind of like pretends that's just a natural inevitability of like the Latin American or whatever the fuck. These coups are US backed. These coups are primarily US backed. And that's not just a Latin American thing. This happened all over Africa, Western-backed coups. In the Middle East, Western-backed coups. In Asia, Indonesia, Suharto. The guy was Western-backed, US-backed.
Story you've probably been told. 1964 military coup overthrew democratically elected President João Goulart. The reality? Well, look, this president, the policy.
It was João Goulart, by the way. I don't know what the fuck João Goulart is. I mean, I shouldn't talk. I suck at pronunciation. I'm sorry, Mr. Crowder.
Destroyed, as we saw before. You know, if it didn't take part in killing 100 million people as the rest of communism, well, inflation at about 100% was pretty bad.
Is he implying that João Goulart was a communist? He is implying that.
GDP non-existent, literally less than 1%. Pretty bad. So what did he propose? Nationalizing foreign oil refineries, by the way, seizing agricultural land, granting voter rights to the illiterate because he knew he would never win an election again. He doubled down on all the policies that were making everybody's lives miserable. And so what happened was the military coup came to, quote, complete the mission of restoring economic and financial order to Brazil. 64 to 74, the economic, you look at inflation, it was cut by 82%. You look at the GDP annual average, right, less than 1%. It went to 13%.
Wow.
Industry growth was up 30%. And again, the coup was supported by the people.
All right. This whole segment has been Crowder implying that Goulart was a communist and he ruined the economy and then the Brazilian dictatorship saved it. This is the argument. Okay. Goulart was a wealthy, elite Catholic landowner who wore a medal of the Virgin Mary around his neck. Okay. He was a member of Brazil's traditional political establishment. He was not some communist outsider. He was politically a moderate. He was a nationalist, liberal, reformist, not a socialist. During his administration, the Brazilian Communist Party even moderated itself significantly. It split from the more revolutionary, like Maoist factions to work peacefully within Brazil's constitutional limits, and it didn't even call for changing the constitution. The Soviets had literally no interest in aiding Goulart because it just wasn't worth provoking the US and the Western Hemisphere. Khrushchev straight up told the Brazilian Communist Party that he had no intention of providing financial aid to Goulart or causing an issue with Washington. Even during the Cuban Missile Crisis, Goulart sided with the Americans and not the Cubans. Despite all of this, the Americans still decided to turn against him because he wasn't sufficiently pro-American business interests, and he decided to implement some moderate reforms to make the lives of his people less miserable. The US implemented a capital strike against Brazil. It dried up all of its economic aid to Goulart's government, and it pressured other international leaders to freeze all further loans to Brazil. Washington funneled millions of dollars directly to conservative state governors in Brazil and other opposition forces who were plotting a coup. This credit freeze left Goulart, also known as Django, that was his nickname, it left Django struggling to finance basic state functions. So similar to how Allende gets blamed for the way his economy looked at a time when it was being sabotaged externally, Django's situation was very similar, except Django wasn't a socialist at all. And even in the midst of this economic warfare that was being waged against him by the US, Goulart refused to capitulate to the conditionalities of the IMF. The IMF was trying to force Brazil into accepting austerity stipulations, and Goulart resisted this because he knew that they would destroy the lives of so many Brazilians. And that decision of his kept him a strong base of support. Crowder takes issue with Django's proposed voter reforms. He was making it seem like those were horrible decisions, a horrible idea by Jango. But Crowder doesn't mention that Brazil, prior to this, had a highly restricted democracy, quote unquote democracy, where a majority of the population, mostly very poor Black Brazilians, were entirely barred from voting due to these really strict literacy requirements. Jango's proposal to extend voting rights to all Brazilians alongside a nationwide literacy campaign was a progressive effort to end systemic racial and economic exclusion. The reforms didn't go through anyways because Jango was overthrown in 1964, but the real reason the elites and the Americans decided that he had to go was because his reforms threatened to expand the franchise, and the oligarchs of Brazil feared that it would permanently dismantle their control over Brazilian politics. It was because of this. Another thing that pissed off the oligarchs was his land reforms, which were moderate land reforms that targeted only idle, uncultivated lands on massive estates and legally mandated that landowners be paid with government bonds. So if you think this is some sort of crazy communist concept, I implore you to look into your own country's eminent domain laws. And crucially, I mentioned this earlier, Jango himself was a latifundista. He was a massive millionaire landowner. He had no personal or ideological interest in destroying private property rights. He never tried to. When it came to nationalizations, a major move of his was aimed at a subsidiary of ITT, the US multinational, for which his government, Jango's government, aimed to provide compensation, which was only delayed due to Brazil's US-inflicted financial crisis. Goulart's primary industrial policy was simply passing a law to limit the amount of profits that foreign multinationals could drain out of the country. This is a standard nationalist measure to protect domestic capital. This is not communism. And the coup that overthrew him did not save the economy. I don't know why the fuck this guy's saying this. It restructured it to benefit foreign creditors and a tiny corporate elite by strangling the working class. It suppressed wages. It destroyed labor unions. Between 1964 and 1976, the military regime cut the real minimum wage in Rio de Janeiro by 34% and cut the national average by over 10%, which triggered a massive increase in extreme poverty and inequality, obviously. In 1965, the regime passed Order 289, which allowed foreign multinational corporations operating in Brazil to obtain loans from abroad at a mere 7 to 8% interest rate with government-backed exchange guarantees, while domestic Brazilian companies were forced to pay interest rates of nearly 50%. This is crushing. Obviously, what this ended up doing was it allowed foreign actors like Ford, Chrysler, I'm pretty sure Volkswagen, to swallow up domestic Brazilian companies and lead to a denationalization of Brazilian industry. The temporary GDP growth of the late 1960s, sure, there was a temporary GDP growth, but that was entirely fueled by a massive influx of foreign loans, which created an unsustainable mountain of debt. By 1980, the bubble burst, which sent Brazil into an aggressive economic depression, and between 1980 to 1983, real GDP fell by 8%, per capita GDP plunged by over 15%, and the manufacturing sector was completely decimated. The only thing that the dictatorship did, when all was said and done, when you zoom out and you look at the grand picture, the only thing that they did was it allowed external creditors and capitalists to pillage Brazil's wealth, which is the whole point of these right-wing dictatorships in the first place, right? They're not there to look out for the people of these countries. They're not there to protect the resources of these countries and make sure that some sort of system is created where the wealth that is derived from those resources actually goes back to the people of the countries where the resources are found. The whole point of these right-wing dictatorships is so that the wealth that is derived from those resources goes to foreign capitalists and typically American business interests if we're talking about Latin America.
This happens all across South America. There's nothing they can do, and so there can be a military to completely oppress and subjugate the people, or the military is used to liberate the people, or used with...
Wow. So he's saying that the military dictatorship in Brazil liberated the people? That's weird. Like, he's operating from this framework where he thinks that the coup had like popular support and it maintained whatever support it had. But pretty much any support that the coup did have almost immediately evaporated once the public realized that the military wasn't just engaging in like a brief reset, and it postponed elections. By 1966, a lot of the regime's initial civilian supporters completely turned against it. By 1968, as poverty deepened due to the regime's highly unpopular wage suppression, massive popular anti-dictatorship student and labor marches erupted. In response to those protests, the military officially, abandoned all pretenses of moderation and closed down democracy entirely. And then there was like a systematic state terror campaign that they unleashed. And then for 21 years, the US backed military dictatorship, which again scrapped elections, boasted a horrible human rights record, which was characterized by systemic torture, extrajudicial executions, mass arrest, and forced disappearances. So I don't know how you could sit here and say that that is the military liberating the people. It's ridiculous. This guy doesn't know fucking anything about this.
The support of the people. Either way, the military is being used because the people can't do a thing. That's what happened in Brazil. The people actually had a huge, it was called the March of the Family with God for Freedom. And that actually took place before the coup happened. And
I think I know exactly where the quote to combat this is. Just give me 1 second. All right, this is William Blum's Killing Hope. He's got a chapter going over this. And he goes, following a victory parade in Rio on 2nd April by those pleased with the coup, a march of family with God for liberty, this is the parade that Crowder was referring to, Gordon, who was the US ambassador, informed the State Department that the only unfortunate note was the obviously limited participation in the march of the lower classes. To frame it as though it's like a popular march leaves out the fact that it was not. It was like the elites, and it was like conservative elements that didn't like Goulart's progressive liberal reformist agenda, but it was not populated by significant working or lower class participation. I guess that's what happens when you actually load up fucking books, right?
case number 3. Go ahead, bring it up. That's fine. Here's a story you probably heard. Far-right Francisco Franco ushered in years of dictatorship after basically taking out the democratically elected government. Did
he put the wrong graphic here? He's talking about Franco now, right? Spain? Anyways, I don't know enough about Franco. I don't know enough about Spain or the Spanish Civil War, and I am a strong proponent in Chairman Mao's mantra of no investigation, no right to speak. This is something that I think Crowder should adopt as a life philosophy, but no, I don't know enough about this, guys, to give you anything substantive. I have no authority to be talking about Spain or Franco or the Spanish Civil War. I study Palestine and Latin America. That's where I'm stronger, and it would be irresponsible of me to cover this Franco stuff. I'm sure it's full of shit. Don't get me wrong. I doubt that Crowder knows what the fuck he's talking about, but it would just be irresponsible of me to be the one to combat it. So let's go to the next segment.
Let's go to case 4, Bolivia. By the way, all the references for these links are in the description. I highly recommend that you read up on this a little bit more, especially Pinochet. That's a fascinating story to see the boom that we saw economically in Chile. So the story you've been told with Bolivia, 71, US-backed dictator Hugo Banzer took power after a violent coup. By the way, there's of course truth to this. US-backed. Do you guys understand?
Yeah.
Again, 100 million dead from communism. The 20th
Presuppositionally flawed video. The whole thing is based on a faulty premise.
century, and there's always some communist turd swirling around in South America. So of course, we're going to have a vested interest and go, oh wait, is there someone who's anything other than communist? Because we don't want that on our continent. So
it's so crazy that right now he's talking about Bolivia. This is going to get really funny because he's framing Torres as a communist. Just keep that in mind. He's not a communist. We'll demonstrate that as the video goes on. But even if he was, man, like even if there were communists in Latin America, fucking based, give me more, please. Why is it this fucking guy's responsibility to flush the quote unquote communist turds in Latin America? Fuck this guy. He's a Canadian turd. I don't want him anywhere near any sort of political discourse. I'm kind of happy that he left Canada so I don't have to share a border with this fucking guy.
Yeah, it doesn't mean that it's just some crazy psyop. It means that there are countries that either were going to or had veered communist, and we kept our eye on it.
And it was almost always Russian-backed communist.
Of course.
It wasn't just...
That's hilarious because it actually just wasn't. In a lot of cases, it just wasn't. Goulart, what I told you about him, how Khrushchev just pretty much said, no, we're not going to help. Jacobo Arbenz was not Russian-backed communist. He wasn't even a communist. He still got overthrown and replaced by Carlos Castillo Armas, who then laid the groundwork for the Mayan genocide. I mean, if these are the options, Jacobo Arbenz with liberal, progressive reforms, very good reforms, don't get me wrong, like great land reforms. I have nothing against Arbenz. But if he's going to be replaced by Carlos Castillo Armas, who then lays the groundwork for a genocide, and these people are going to side with the latter, that speaks to their character. That's insane how you would prefer this mass murderer to a guy that you just hallucinated as a communist.
communism like happened.
Right.
You know? So we were fighting a proxy war, essentially.
Exactly. Anyone out there who thinks that Russia, China, Iran, that they don't play favorites in international affairs, you're a silly person. So the real story is 71. Yeah, Hugo.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Very funny how none of these coups and invasions before the Cold War are mentioned. Yeah, how many times did they invade Haiti, Cuba, Nicaragua before the Cold War? Presuppositionally, again, is completely flawed.
So the real story is 71. Yeah, Hugo Banzer took power after a violent coup. Let's read this from Harper's. It says, Banzer's 3-day coup in August 1971 was significant not only for the fighting that accompanied it, which left 110 dead and 600 wounded, but for the 7-year regime that followed, one of the most repressive in Bolivia's history. Here's the reality. Okay. 52 to 1970, Bolivia had this crazy leftist revolution. They nationalized mines, oil, a lot of land to be clear. So very similar to what you see in places like Cuba, right? What they don't tell you is not only the people killed, but before you had a military coup. Let me ask you this. How do you think you nationalize mines?
This guy knows that Pinochet did nationalizations too, right?
Oil or land? Where the government takes it.
The people, they willingly give it up.
Right.
They're tired of dealing with them themselves.
Right.
Brother, this is not some sort of crazy communist concept like eminent domain that exists in America. If the government says, oh, we have to expropriate your property, they're going to do it. They're going to compensate for you. That's enshrined in international law, by the way. A government has a right to expropriate the companies that are operating on its soil. That is enshrined in international law.
Right.
It's hard.
So that means guys with guns come and take it away. And very often you can go click these links. They don't list that as the same violence, or they don't put in the same category as the coup that followed it. So they'll just mention like...
Because it's not the same violence. That's an international right. You are allowed to expropriate with compensation the companies or the land or the resources that fall within your borders. That's internationally protected right. Unilaterally overthrowing a government by military force is not. That would be the difference.
Well, they instituted policies. Nationalize. So when men come in and take your stuff, take your private stuff, your personal stuff with guns.
Not personal stuff. Private property, personal property are not the same thing.
It's a policy. When men fight those people with equal guns, oh, it's a coup. So you see the scam that's being played? Then 70 to 71, you had the it was a leftist Torres seized power.
This guy doesn't know fucking anything.
Crazy, even more radical government, leftist government. And they basically replaced what...
This is hilarious. This is how you know this motherfucker knows nothing. He's trying to imply that Torres was some crazy, radical, leftist, communist. It's really funny when people make that claim, because a lot of people don't actually know that Torres served as the chief of staff of the Bolivian armed forces under René Barrientos, the Bolivian president responsible for the execution of Che Guevara, and Torres literally cast his vote in favor of killing Che Guevara at the time. This is your radical leftist principled communist guy, bro? Please, what the fuck? He wasn't a communist, he wasn't a socialist, he was like a progressive military leader who used the state to rescue people from poverty and reclaim national sovereignty. You gotta keep in mind, these Latin American economies had been pillaged by foreign capitalists. So the desire to reclaim their own resources is entirely logical. It doesn't take a Marxist to come to that conclusion.
Crazy, even more radical government, leftist government. And they basically replaced what you know as Congress with a workers' Soviet. So the result was Hugo Banzer, staged a coup with the support of a huge percentage of the population who were helpless and could do nothing. And what were the results? Well, you saw GDP double its historical average. You saw prices stabilize. You saw a foreign investment boom that you had not seen at any other point. So again, policies. They nationalized list businesses here. And then there was a violent coup against it. Let me ask you, you think the violent coup might have included some people who had their shit nationalized?
All right. So he's framing it as though Torres like structurally decimated the Bolivian economy, and then Hugo Banzer with the mandate from the masses came and saved everyone. It's literally the same shit he's done with all the other examples. No, the idea that Bolivia's economy was even significantly undermined by Torres is completely silly. It's actually illogical. The guy was in power for less than 10 months. It's an incredibly brief window of time, next to impossible to structurally destroy a country's economic foundation. But the challenges that plagued Torres's administration had little to do with economic mismanagement on his part, it was kind of the same thing that we already been over with Chile and Brazil. He was being externally sabotaged by an aggressive US financial blockade. It's kind of hard to run an economic project when the world's superpower is, dead set on destroying it. Hugo Banzer, the right-wing dictator who replaced Torres, did not ride to power on a wave of popular support. He was installed by a far-right military coup that was actively coordinated and backed by the Nixon administration. Banzer ruled through absolute state terror. He outlawed trade unions. He censored the press. He systematically tortured, exiled, and disappeared hundreds of political dissidents and students and workers and etc. A good example, actually, of his lack of popularity came in the form of the 1977 hunger strike, where 4 women and 12, maybe 14 children from the tin mines traveled to La Paz and launched a hunger strike because they were fed up with the dictatorship's refusal to grant amnesty to political prisoners. That protest spread and sparked a massive popular movement across Bolivia that ultimately forced Banzer to grant amnesty and back down. And the idea that he saved Bolivia's economy is bullshit. He threw Bolivia into a foreign debt trap. Eduardo Galeano covers this in Open Veins of Latin America, and he explains how in 1969, every Bolivian owed $137 to foreigners, and by 1977, that figure had skyrocketed to $483. So instead of fostering legitimate economic growth, Banzer, when he wasn't ballooning the debt, and his crew were heavily implicated in the illegal cocaine trade, which started in the mid-1970s, and the recycling of narco dollars was a primary funder behind the services that were allotted to the upper classes as well as the real estate boom in the late 1970s. So this is not genuine economic productivity. It's drug dealing and taking a bunch of foreign debt.
So yeah, it doesn't mean that you should support every person with a fascist moniker next to their name. But it also doesn't mean it's accurate. I think if someone says, well, look at the fascists, almost invariably, if you look at history, even the bad fascists, they were a mistaken response to equally bad Marxists or leftists. And communism has killed far more people, and it's not even close. It's not even close.
Wrong.
So rather than starting history with the response, the left literally doesn't want you to look just a little bit further. Just do this. Anytime you hear about fascists, whether it's Pinochet, whether it's Banzer, take your pick. Just rewind the tape by 2 years.
Couldn't this apply to communists? Oh, you don't like the Bolshevik Revolution. Rewind the clock. What was happening? Oh, Tsarist Russia. Way worse. Oh, you don't like Mao's revolution. Rewind the clock. What was worse? Japanese occupation? Oh, you don't like Castro and Che's revolution. What was worse? Rewind the clock. Fulgencio Batista, who killed 20,000 Cubans, a larger proportion of the Cuban population than the amount of Americans who died in both world wars? That's the guy you like better than Castro? So why does this logic not hold true for communist revolutions? Why only fascist ones? This is crazy.
Years more than whenever the person telling you the story starting off. They start off in 64, just rewind to 62. They start off in 71, just rewind to 69. They'll go, oh, I get it. Doesn't mean it's right, but I get it. Let me ask you this. What would you do in this country? What would you do in this country if you had an election, and I'm not saying that this has happened, to be clear, but if you had an election verifiably stolen, and then you had, let's say, the DSA come in, pack the courts, eliminate the Electoral College, legalize every single illegal alien in this country, and by the way, usher in another 20 million more, so that you would have socialism forever, and they would use that political capital and power to nationalize your
Based, dude. Holy fuck.
private shit. Think you'd support a coup? Or would that be too fascist for you? In South America, historically, your choice is between a communist or a fascist. It's not just like, well, let's let cooler temperatures prevail.
Yeah.
That's not what happens.
Well, and these guys, I hate the fascist monikers throwing around. What is it, like a 14 points? Like, here's what a true fascist really is. And there's a bunch of things that they have to meet. And almost nobody that they point to and claim as a fascist actually meets all of those except for Benito.
Okay, they're now making the argument that the quote-unquote fascists in Latin America aren't actually fascists, but they're okay with calling their opposition, the left-wing people, communists when the majority of them are not communists. The furthest they'll go is like pink for the most part, save for Cuba.
Mussolini, and that's about it. And I'm not even sure he met all 14, to be clear.
There must be one near the back.
Well, but everybody tries to say, well, Trump is a anybody you think has power is a fascist. To you. That's really what it comes down to.
Well, because
These guys called João Goulart a communist. He was a liberal. He was a Catholic latifundista millionaire.
can't stand power that's outside of their collective.
Exactly. Did
That's
Barack Obama have power?
Yeah.
Did he force through things that the American public didn't want by bending everybody's will to what he wanted? Yes, of course. So was he a fascist?
Yeah.
No, it's just more like an authoritarian. Oh, okay, so you like authoritarianism.
Wouldn't even say that.
Yeah.
They wouldn't say that either.
I can't watch these guys. I'm sorry, guys. I'm calling it here.